Lieutenant Commander Data, the android who yearns above all else to be human. On its surface, this is a straightforward concept for a character, but the more we learn about Data as his story unfolds, the more this character confronts us with some difficult questions about our own humanity.
Intriguing.
So in this video, we're going to look closely at Data's character arc, because I don't think there's another character in all of fiction who's quite like him. So let's get into it on The Art of Storytelling. I think the best place to start is with Gene Roddenberry's original intent for the character, which can be put very simply. Data is a synthetic being who gradually becomes more human without ever fully getting there. So right from the beginning, this character had not only a clear development trajectory, but also a definite limitation. It gives you a sense of Gene Roddenberry's wisdom and insight that he designed the character this way. Data, as we'll see, is deeply paradoxical. If you look past his painted skin and yellow eyes, he's basically indistinguishable from a human being. And the more time you spend with him, the more you begin to feel that the humanity he seeks to achieve is perhaps not so far from his grasp. And yet we're persistently reminded through some clever acting and some practical effects that he is a machine, a marvelously advanced machine, but a machine nonetheless. It's an elegant contradiction, and it confronts the viewer with a question, one that is posed in various ways throughout the series. How is this highly complex synthetic life form any different from you and me? Now, Data is by no means the first character to pose this kind of question. In fact, he's part of a long tradition of outsider characters who, because of some fundamental difference, look into humanity from a somewhat removed perspective. Data is in some ways a successor to the character Spock from the original series, who does have emotions, but who suppresses them through reason and discipline. Data is also very similar to the replicants of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, loosely based on Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. The replicants also raise philosophical and moral questions about artificial life, especially given their subhuman status and short lifespan. The droids from Star Wars might come to mind here, but the similarities are mostly superficial in this case. Star Wars generally avoids posing too many questions about the sentience of its droid characters, and they tend to be more functional anyway, more like kitchen appliances. Sorry, 3PO. That's not to say that they're never humanized to any degree, but they have a more magical quality owing to the more fantastical nature of Star Wars. Going way back, you could look at Fritz Lang's Metropolis, often cited as giving us the first android ever shown on film. And in literature, you could even point to Frankenstein's monster as a prototypical android character. Now, speaking of the word android, it was historically used in reference to automata, old mechanical devices that seem to perform human activities. Think of the dancing wedding procession in Munich's famous Glockenspiel, or the creepy toys that kids played with in the 1800s. In fact, if there's any one fictional character that is most like Data, it's probably Pinocchio, the wooden puppet who longs to be a real boy. This similarity was certainly recognized by the show's writers and was even referenced in the show.
Nice to meet you, Pinocchio.
But despite being part of a long tradition of android-esque characters, Data is different in one critical way, and that is just how close he is to being human. The other androids are roughly human, but Data is as human as one can be, while still being technically artificial. It's kind of interesting that the earlier concept for Data was that he would have exposed circuitry that made him look more robotic. But in the end, they realized that this would make it more difficult to humanize his character. Instead, we only occasionally see his mechanical insides, and this means Data is much less like the cartoonishly robotic C-3PO, and much more like Roy Batty, whose humanity is left up to the viewer's interpretation. A lot of Data's basic biography is established in TNG's first season. We learn that Data is an orphan. He was discovered by Starfleet on the planet Omicron Theta, the only survivor after the total destruction of an Earth colony by a giant life-devouring crystal. He was designed and built by a human named Dr. Noonien Soong, a genius in the field of cybernetics. And Data's positronic brain gives him exceptional computational power, though he struggles to understand the basic idiosyncrasies of social interaction. Watching the first season of TNG, it's clear that Brent Spiner was still figuring out precisely how mechanical Data should be, and his androidness played as a bit of a novelty in these first episodes. His movements are sometimes a bit too robotic, and his mannerisms are sometimes a bit too human. But But that's not a criticism. On the contrary, Brent Spiner should be credited with having the wisdom and insight to let the character grow and develop organically over time. We learn a lot more about Data throughout the show, but there are a few key episodes that focus primarily on Data's growth and transformation, which I'll focus on in this video. Beginning with the episode Data Lore, we learn that Dr. Soong in fact created another identical android before Data, his diabolical twin brother, Lore, also played by Spiner. It's one of the first episodes that explores the moral dimension of Data's identity in greater detail, including Captain Picard's observation that
we are merely a different variety of machine, in our case, electrochemical in nature.
Lore will be a recurring character, and as we'll see, Data's family is really the main focus of his development. The big thing that we take away from Lore is that Data could be very different if he were configured differently, and this opens up the possibilities of Data's character. We get a sense of what he could be like if he were more human. We also learn one important detail about Data, and that is that he has an off switch that he understandably wants to keep private.
If you had an off switch, Doctor, would you not keep it secret?
I guess I would.
This is a brilliant touch because it clearly marks him as a machine. This is used to great effect in The Measure of a Man Season 2. This episode is often cited by fans and the cast as one of the best in the series because it proved the show capable of handling more serious subjects. In this case, the question of the legal rights of synthetic life, or going a layer deeper, the moral implications of man's tendency to other and dehumanize those who are different. What begins as a hearing about whether Data is Starfleet property turns out to be a searing indictment of human prejudice. And a key moment comes when Commander Riker exposes Data's lack of autonomy by simply switching him off.
Pinocchio is broken. Its strings have been cut.
The fact that this is done in the context of a legal proceeding is really important. You know, there are many ways that human culture has tried to define what the key ingredient of a human being is. A religious person might say that it's a soul or free will. A philosopher might say that it takes thought or self-awareness. A scientist might say that humanity is just a biological category. But this episode asks, what is the legal definition of personhood? And that frames Data's humanity as a moral question, rather than simply some abstract philosophical or scientific question. And that deepens his character in a big way and hints at things to come. These questions are explored further in Season 3 with The Offspring. The premise is similar, except now Starfleet wants to study a cybernetic being that Data has himself created, his daughter, Lal. She's a somewhat more rudimentary and childlike version of Data, who struggles even more than he does to grasp the subtleties of social interaction, despite Data's efforts to guide her as a parent. When Captain Picard discovers that Data has conceived Lal, he actually scolds him for not asking for permission, to which Data replies,
I have not observed anyone else on board consulting you about their procreation, Captain.
This is a clever illustration of the fact that even Data's closest friends have an unconscious prejudice towards synthetic life. And again, it poses the question of what the boundaries of Data's autonomy and personhood really are. When Lal learns that she's going to be taken by Starfleet and separated from Data, she has an emotional reaction, which leads to a critical malfunction, and her ensuing deactivation is one of the most emotional scenes in the series.
I love you, Father.
I wish I could feel it with you.
I will feel it for both of us.
Data processes her death in a very android way, saying that he will add her memories to his. But this leaves a lingering question. If Data adds Lal's experience to his own, doesn't he also absorb Lal's emotional memory? And this is where I think Data's character gets really interesting. It's when we begin to speculate that Data might, in his own way, have emotions, albeit of a different nature. We're generally told that Data doesn't have emotions, and he certainly believes that he doesn't. But the thing that's so great about TNG is that the writers trust the viewer to read between the lines and contemplate the bigger ideas. Watch the last shot of this episode. On the one hand, there's nothing in Brent Spiner's very subtle performance that tells you necessarily that he's feeling anything as he sits back down at the helm after losing his daughter. But this shot certainly suggests that Data has changed as a result of his experience, and it makes you wonder, if Data did have emotions, would he even realize it? On the other hand, are you, the viewer, projecting your own feelings onto Data? Again, this is getting at why Data is such an interesting character. It's the ambiguity of his humanity that makes him unique. There's an episode in season 4 called Brothers that's probably the most consequential episode in Data's 7-season arc. It begins when a kind of homing beacon activates in Data's brain, causing him to hijack the Enterprise and travel to a distant world. I love this episode because you get to see just how much smarter Data is than the rest of the crew. He kind of casually takes over the ship by strategically locking the crew out of the ship's computer and command functions. Classic TNG, really fun to watch. It's revealed that this homing device was triggered by Dr. Noonien Soong, also played by Spiner. Turns out he survived the crystalline entity's attack on Omicron Theta and has at long last perfected an emotion chip that he wants to give to Data. Unfortunately, Lore also turns up and tricks Dr. Soong into giving the emotion chip to him. Now, this chip is the single most important thing in Data's character arc, because if Data gets emotions, he gets much closer to being human, which means his character gets that much closer to being resolved, and that means his story gets that much closer to being over. The emotion chip tells us that Data's quest to become human is more than an abstract aspiration. There's actually a hardware upgrade that will get him there, and the big question moving forward is when and how that will occur. There's another episode in season 4 called In Theory that I think deserves an honorable mention here. A crew member develops romantic feelings for Data, who she feels is a nice change from her previous partner, who was emotionally unpredictable. The two begin dating, and Data tries his best to develop a romantic subroutine, which ultimately fails when she realizes that he cannot genuinely care about her.
Are we no longer a couple?
The episode has another one of those poignant endings that leaves you in contemplation of what Data is. After basically getting dumped, Data responds in very android-like fashion.
Then I will delete the appropriate program.
He's left sitting alone in his quarters, except here comes Spot, Data's cat, who jumps on his lap and begins to purr.
Hello, Spot.
And if you think this is just a cute little detail tacked onto the ending, think again. The point is that Spot doesn't know that Data is an artificial life form and doesn't care. Data's girlfriend couldn't find it in herself to love Data, but Spot doesn't have that problem. So it makes you wonder how much of our feelings about Data might be different if we didn't know he was a synthetic life form. Again, this just highlights the bias that we all have towards biological life as uniquely endowed with personhood and consciousness. More on Spot later, because he's really the key to everything. And yes, I know there's debate about Spot's gender. The next big development comes in Dissent. On an away mission in which they encounter the Borg, Data experiences anger when he kills a Borg drone, and it's revealed later he also felt pleasure in doing so. This causes Data to wonder if, in his quest to become human, he might become a bad human. The question here is whether becoming human is necessarily something worth aspiring to at all. It turns out that Lore is using the stolen emotion chip to manipulate Data in his project of liberating the Borg from the collective. He instructs Data to perform life-threatening experiments on his best friend Geordi. Turns out that Data having emotions might not be such a good thing after all. In the end, Data is freed from Lore's spell and deactivates him, at last taking possession of the emotion chip that Dr. Soong intended for him. But Data does not install it. In fact, he tries to destroy it before Geordi intervenes at the last second. So the thing Data wants more than anything is within his grasp, and yet he doesn't take it. This is an interesting decision on the part of the writers, and there could be many reasons for it. One is that they knew that the series was coming to a close. Pre-production for Star Trek Generations actually began during season 7 of TNG, so they were in the awkward position of having to resolve some of the characters while still leaving room for development in the upcoming feature films. The trouble with the emotion chip is that it's kind of the endpoint in Data's character arc. Short of becoming biological, there's not much left for him to strive for after getting emotions, though I actually think there's potentially one more thing, which we'll get to. In any case, the writers opted to leave this final step in Data's journey for the big screen, for better or worse. There's one more episode that needs to be mentioned, and that is Season 7's Inheritance, We learn that Dr. Soong had a wife on Omicron Theta who was essentially Data's mother. After being critically injured during the attack on the colony, her consciousness was transferred into an android body, one even more sophisticated than Data's. She's so convincingly biological that Data is the only one who can perceive that she is an android. In fact, she herself is unaware of it. This is revealed in a scene on the holodeck in which Data has a conversation with a much younger Noonien Soong. By the way, let's just stop and appreciate the fact that Data's entire family history is portrayed by Brent Spiner. And that brings us to the end of Data's arc in the television series, which, in my view, is a wonderfully self-contained story. No sequels, spin-offs, or reboots necessary. The show ends with Data's quest to become human beautifully unresolved, in keeping with Gene Roddenberry's original concept for the character. The moral of his story seems to be that the quest to become human is one we must all embark on, and one that is never finished. But this show is too popular to not continue, and we have 4 feature films and 1 spin-off TV series to include in our analysis. Some of it good, some of it bad. First, the good. Star Trek Generations. This is where we finally get to see Data use the emotion chip and make his final transformation into his most human self. Throughout the film, he struggles to control his emotions, which are so intense that they overwhelm him, but this leads to a poignant conclusion, which, for me anyway, works as the best resolution of Data's character. It's a beautifully written scene in which Data rescues Spot from the wreckage of the Enterprise D. Data naively believes that the chip is malfunctioning, causing him to cry, even though he's happy. But Counselor Troy, his longtime friend and therapist, sees it differently.
I am happy to see Spot, yet I am crying. Perhaps the chip is malfunctioning.
I think it's working perfectly.
This is the most human we ever see Data. In this moment, the fact that he's a synthetic being melts away. And I think it's actually the only moment we have with Data in which his humanity is completely unambiguous. And if this was where his story ended, I think that would be very appropriate. Of course, that is not the case. Subsequent films meant the writers had to extend his character further by suggesting that he still has some ways to go in becoming human. First Contact does an admirable job with this, but it does start to feel slightly protracted. In fact, I suspect the writers knew at this point that there was only one place left for Data's character to go, only one thing which, if achieved, would confirm his humanity once and for all, and that is, of course, his death. This was attempted in Star Trek Nemesis, but unfortunately, it was not very well executed and turned out to be a bit of a missed opportunity. Data's death had the potential to be one of the most powerful moments in the entire Star Trek franchise, something with real gravity, but the scene felt unceremonious for a character who deserved a more meaningful sacrifice and a more respectful send-off. The recent Picard TV series tried to rectify this by killing him again in a different way, but it didn't work either. And even that death was undone by the 3rd season, and by that point the whole thing was just a confused mess. That series ends with Data alive and well, playing cards with his fellow crewmates, and that's fine. But it must be said that if you look at the full canon of Data's story, the dramatic value accrued through years of thoughtful character writing never really got cashed in with a defining dramatic moment. In the end, this might be a consequence of the fact that TV shows and film sequels often don't afford their writers the luxury of having a definite endpoint with which to orient their storytelling. Or it might be because The Next Generation was written by an older generation of writers, and something of Data's essence was lost in the various handoffs that have taken place as this IP has struggled to reach its previous heights. But that's fine, because it's still illuminating to watch Data in old episodes of TNG. Like any good character, you can always revisit him and learn something new. I'm sure everybody takes something different from the time they've spent with Data, but for me, his lesson can be put pretty simply. In learning about the ways that Data is different from us, we begin to see the ways that we are the same as him, because the thing that he desires the most is already within him. His effort to become human is what makes him human. So thanks for watching. Check out my Patreon if you'd like to support this channel, and I'll see you on the next one.